Okay, guys. Sorry, I hit the wrong button, so we're gonna have to do chapter 30 in two parts. Apologize for that. Okay, so continuing on, the fruits of industrialization. Again, there are in the long term, industrialization is a tremendous benefit to society and to a host of people. You get a lot of technological innovations. Remember that this is a period that is going to uh, jumpstart humans into all these crazy inventions. We get improved agricultural tools such as the cotton gin and the mechanical reaper and things like that. Um, you get cheap manufactured goods, which what's good about that is it allows for cheaper products that people can buy. In the middle ages, a lot of times a farming family might only have two pairs of clothes, the clothes that they wore Monday through Saturday, and then their Sunday best that they wore only to go to church services. So now people are able to buy a lot more clothes and consumer goods and things like that. So it's a tremendous help to society there. Travel and transportation, the transportation revolution, which is fueled by the industrial revolution. Um, just so many things that it leads to. The railways changed the world in so many ways. It's insane. Besides passenger carry, it connects the United States coast to coast. This enormous country does the same thing for Russia. So it helps shrink large countries. Makes wealthy economies. It's insane, really. All right, population growth. Here in the 1700s, you see Europe versus America. Obviously, Europe has a tremendous lead on us there, and they're going to keep that all the way through. But you do see a quick spike in growth every 100 years there, and that is in part to the Industrial Revolution and the increased, over time at least, standard of living. Right, demographics. When we talk about demographics, we're talking about the population of people, where they are, where they live, and where they move, and stuff like that. Industrialization results in marked decline of both fertility and mortality. Again, it depends on what time you're talking about, but in the early days, people actually, the lifespan in some of the early British cities that were industrialized actually went down to about 25 years because the pollution was so bad. Fertility is affected as well, especially, sometimes there's just not so much time because women are beginning to work now. They're working in the factories. Um, and in the cities, children are much more liability to have huge families than out on the farm where you can always at least feed your children. Cost of living increased in industrial societies. These cities became destination places, and as such, real estate rates increase. I think of New York City and Los Angeles. They're the two most expensive places to live in America. There are two biggest cities. There's a lot of wealth there, and so they're a destination for a lot of people. Urbanization proceeds dramatically. In 1800, only 20% of Britons lived in towns with a population of over 10,000. Remember that Europe has been rural, for a very, very, very long time. But by 1900, 75% of Britons lived in urban environments. Again, massive demographic transition from the country to the city. That's a theme that's easy to remember. Make sure you remember it. Contraception. And contraception is basically the purposeful um, to limit the number of children you have. Okay. And we've had it for thousands of years, but it's going to get better in this time period because people are worried about overpopulation. These cities are getting enormous in Europe, and it's blowing their minds, and people are freaking out and whatnot. And so you see this guy here who's predicts an overpopulation crisis, sort of what we're doing right now, right? We have an overpopulation crisis on our hands. We're going to have too many people for the earth to sustain by 2050 and whatnot. All right. Ended up inventing condoms in England. Originally, they were made from animal intestines, and later on would be made out of latex. All right, development of slums. Of course, you're going to have this. London has 1 million people in 1800, and by 1850, they've increased to 2.4 million people. Wealthy classes want to get away from the working class people, so they move out to the suburbs so they can be surrounded by good sights and by people more in their socioeconomic status. Industrial slum areas developed in city centers, slums and ghettos, things like that. Open gutters as sewage systems. All that means is that they dumped, they had chamber pots and you dumped it out the window. So cities stank so bad in the early industrial periods. They didn't have the infrastructure, they didn't have the sewage. And so you had epidemics like cholera that would occasionally pop up and get people. Now, the first sewage systems piped water only in 1848. So it takes that long, almost basically 100 years after the Industrial Revolution started, to kind of get a hold on it. And you had lots of problems in the early days. Crimes were a problem. Transportation was a problem because there were so many people. So you had to eventually develop subways and bus systems and stuff like that. Fire was a problem because you had a lot of buildings stacked on top of each other, essentially. So there were a lot of issues that we had to overcome. Transcontinental, across the continent migrations. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, you have so much population growth that people want to escape it, and it drives a lot of Europeans to the Americas. The destination of choice, of course, was the United States. Over 50 million people crossed the Atlantic, and they're doing it for different reasons. Britain to avoid living in the squalor, the Irish to avoid the potato famines of the 1840s that killed about 1 million of them, and Jews come to America to get away from Russia's pogroms, where they were targeting Jews. And so the United States becomes a destination. We're industrialized. We have great room for growth. And so people love it. Land of opportunity. New social classes. Economic factors resulted in a decline of slavery. Capitalist wealth brought new status to non-aristocratic families. Again, you have non-nobility in Europe and non-planters in America. You have city people who are rich. So you get this new urban class of professionals. You also have a rise in blue-collar factory workers, your everyday person that goes to work for 14 hours a day and then goes home. They don't get paid great, but they have a steady job. And in certain cases, it's good. In certain cases, it's bad. Urban environment also created new types of diversions. That's very important. Cities become places of entertainment. You get sporting events, you get boxing, you get racing, you get football, you get baseball. All these sports develop. You got Coney Island, you get these amusement parks. Cities are the place to go. Museums, Broadway shows. Women in the workforce, also a very important theme here. In the early days, agricultural and the cottage industry work involved women. Remember, they're the ones that are sewing these dresses and shirts together. So it was a natural transition for them to leave the home and go work in the factories. But the development of men as the prime breadwinners and women in the private sphere, that still develops. And, so the idea being that men are going to get paid more because they are supporting the family. They're supposed to make the most money. And they make more money, so it gives them leverage over wives. Keep that in mind too. Plus, women, have this double burden. When they do choose to go work, and for many women, it was very independent to do so. But when they do choose to go work, they're expected to clean the house and cook and do all those things as well when they get home from a long day at work. In this time period, you had the development of child labor. And kids as young as 5 are working in factories, sometimes as much as 13 hours a day. You had deaths. You had maimed children, for sure. Eventually, they're going to, make some child labor laws, but it takes a while. Children were easily exploited. They had low wages, about a sixth to as much as just a third of adult male wages. And because they're children, the discipline is even harsher on them. However, their size gives them some advantages. When you're in these textile factories and you have all these spinning wheels and gears and pulleys and stuff that's real tight in there, the smaller children can get in there better than a full-grown person can. Of course, it's dangerous, all that spinning machinery and stuff, but kids are sitting in there. In the coal tunnels, some of those mine shafts were really small and tight, and so it was easier to get the children to go in there. Children made up 29% of the cotton industry in 1838. That's kind of a staggering number. But there's going to be a pushback against child labor. And you get the Factory Act of 1833, which made a minimum working age of 9 years old, which is pretty crazy to us, obviously, right? We're kind of shielded from that until our mid to late teens. And most of the jobs that we work when we do choose to work are certainly not as difficult as these. Now, there were those families, the poorest families did not like these factory acts and stuff because they needed every single person in their family to work to make it. And that's kind of some of the bad parts of the Industrial Revolution is that some capitalist somewhere is fat rich, but the people working at his factory can barely survive, working paycheck to paycheck, and they have to have all their children working and whatnot just to make it. So there were some negative aspects of it for a while. Which leads us to the socialist challenge. You have people examining the capitalist system. They see the byproducts of it, the negative byproducts of it, and they don't like it and they want to change. Socialism first used in context, the word basically of it, of Utopian Socialist by Charles Fourier, and you can see his years there, and Robert Owen. And they oppose the competition of a market system. They're looking at no social classes. They're wanting everyone to be on the same level. They attempted to create small model communities, and there are a ton of these in America. We'll learn them in more detail in A-Push, actually, than we will here in AP World. And there's several interesting ones for sure. But most of them really weren't that successful. Now, the socialism that gets a lot more airtime when it comes to studying history was the communism by the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and Germans. And there's two major classes: capitalists who controlled the means of production, and the proletariat, the wage workers who basically sell their labor. They felt that capitalism was exploitative in its nature, that it used and abused the workers to get rich while the workers stayed poor. There's some argument there. I mean, there's some merit to what they're saying. They argue for an overthrow of capitalists in favor of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Basically, what they wanted to happen was that, and what they believed would happen, is that one day the workers would realize that they outnumbered those fat cat bosses, and they would rise up and take the factories from the bosses, and that they would share the factories amongst themselves, and they would run the factories, and everybody would be basically sharing things evenly, and they'd run the capitalist bosses off. The end result of this would be something called communism. It's pretty idealistic. I get where they're coming from, because it's pretty nasty early on in the Industrial Revolution. And communism's attractive to those people who are living in squalor, who are hoping for better days. Now, as time moves on, and we're going to talk a lot about communism from here on out, as time moves on, communism is going to become less attractive because governments finally start putting in regulations to help workers, minimum wages, vacations, and stuff like that. Socialism had a major impact on 19th century reformers, people who are looking for change. Helped reduce property requirements for male suffrage for the right to vote, addressed issues of medical insurance, unemployment compensation, retirement benefits. Now, all these things come much later. You're talking really in the early 1900s before you get any of this stuff. Trade unions formed for collective bargaining. You had to. A single unskilled laborer could get nothing done. There's always somebody willing to take your place. So a boss would just fire you and not blink. But if you have a factory and you have 1,500 workers and all 1,500 workers strike, that's costing you money. So they have leverage there. They have power in these trade unions. There are battles between the owners of the factories and the strikers where people are killed. Even in America, there are times where these protests lead to people being shot and killed. Industrialization in Russia and Japan is also very important. It happens later there in those two places. But it does get there. Eventually, Russia would construct a huge railway network across Siberia under the finance minister, Count Sergei Witte. That's the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It's the longest railroad in the world, about 6,000 miles across Russia. Now, Japanese government took initiative by hiring thousands of foreign experts. Japan is basically going to come out of their isolationism, and part of it starts in 1853 when the American Commodore Matt Perry basically shows up in Japan and forces them to open up to trade to America. And then Japan does, and they begin industrializing and westernizing. And that's going to give Japan a leg up on China and all those other Asian countries over there for a long time. And Japan's still a powerhouse. They're the third richest country in the world right now. All right, global ramifications. You get a division of labor, rural societies that produce raw materials. So you had the country folk doing that. Urban societies that produce the manufactured goods. They're making the stuff. But there was uneven economic development. And places like America, many places in Europe and Japan and Russia, they're industrialized, what we used to call first world countries. But a lot of areas like sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South and East Asia, and Southeast Asia, they're the third world countries. They're the ones that have low wages and small domestic markets, and they're being exploited and they're being abused. They're not in the industrial circle. Okay, so that's it for part 2. Industrial Revolution is we've talked up to this point in history about how important the Neolithic Revolution was and how it led to civilization and things of that nature. The Industrial Revolution might be the next most important event in our history. It has such huge ramifications for life as we know it. The life that we enjoy, the modern life that we enjoy now, really begins with the Industrial Revolution. Keep the themes in mind about short-term and long-term, how it had some negative aspects for a lot of people early, but eventually we would get better standards of living. Women would get more power and more leverage because of the Industrial Revolution. So you kind of keep a pros and cons list going on when you talk about this chapter. Okay, guys, thanks for listening. Make sure you smash that like button, that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.